Hi, I'm Fran Costigan, and I am delighted to welcome you to the August live event for our Essential Vegan Desserts course. I want you to know this is my favorite part of the month, being here with old friends and new friends to talk about food, specifically desserts. And today's topic is fruit, but of course we can be talking about other things too. I'm happy to take your questions. There is a very easy way to put the questions in the queue, and please feel free to do so. I want to welcome Ruby students from across all the boards, all the courses. I want to welcome my newest group of Essential Vegan Desserts students. Everyone's doing a fabulous job, and I hope there are some graduates here and guests. Welcome. Before I dive into fruit, I have a bunch of fruit sitting right to my right, and a couple of other things like chocolate, because chocolate goes with everything in my world. I just want to go over a couple of things. If there is anyone here in Essential Vegan Desserts who has not yet joined the Facebook group, this is a private group for our course, please do so. Patrick, our wonderful producer, is going to put the link up so you can do that. And that's a great place to interact with other people. Maybe you want to know, do you have a brand of cocoa powder that you like better than others, or recommendations for equipment, for example? That's a great place to ask the question and post photos too. Interact with each other. There have been a lot of nice friendships made, so don't forget to go there. For any questions of a technical nature, something that isn't working for you tech-wise, then you're going to write to support@ruby.com, and someone from the team will definitely get back to you. You can always reach me at fran@ruby.com, but before you do that, sometimes I actually send an email having to do with an assignment, or if I have a question to whomever, I will send an email and you can write back to me. But a great place for questions that will help everyone is in the Q&A that is within the syllabus. And before you ask the question, and believe me, you are encouraged to ask questions, you might want to check at the particular assignment and see what other people have said, because sometimes there is already a conversation there. So when you post your photos on social media, and I hope you're doing that, I'm seeing a lot, it would be really helpful if you do hashtag Essential Vegan Desserts, all one word, so we can find each other. And that's a great thing to do. And now I really want to get started with fruit desserts. I'm in the East. I'm in the United States. In the East, we just finished a major thunderstorm, so I'm really happy about that. I was thinking I was going to have to say, oh, I'm sorry about the noise outside, but that's finished. But that means it's summer and I am eating summer fruit. I know that not everyone is in this hemisphere. I was talking with one of my favorite graduate students, very talented student by the name of Miggs, who told me last night through the Facebook group that it is winter in New Zealand. And I do know that because I had the opportunity to visit New Zealand a couple of years ago. It's really beautiful. And she mentioned a couple of fruits. I knew kiwi. I didn't know two of the others. So for me, whether it's fruits or vegetables, I like to eat seasonally and local food as possible. With this global pandemic, food it's been a little bit more difficult for a lot of us to get things that we are used to eating. But I subscribe to a service in Philadelphia called Philly Food Works, and I get to choose produce that I want delivered to my home every week. And our farmers markets have just opened up. So I'm good with food. And fruit is something that I like very much in all kinds of ways, certainly in sweet applications or sweet, desserts, and sometimes savory too. I have this bowl here, and I'm very proud of this bowl because these herbs came from my garden. I have basil, and I have mint, and I have this lemon verbena. I wish you could smell it. It's so fragrant, and I like to use fresh herbs in my fruit desserts. They make a great garnish. They're healthy, and they perk things up. So I also have from my garden, Char Nolan, who's a friend of mine in Philadelphia, and she works with Ruby as well. That's one of the hats she wears. We call these our $25 tomatoes. So these came from my terrace garden. I live on the 30th floor, and I am growing things this year. I love to have some tomatoes along with herbs in my fruit salads. I think they're just wonderful. So at the most basic, for people who want a gluten-free, oil-free, sugar-free dessert, think about eating fruit in its natural state. That can be out of hand if it's delicious. You can combine fruits to make a lovely fruit salad. I think a little bit of acid is always beneficial to perk up the taste. Some herbs, as I said, not all fruits are the same sweetness level. If something doesn't taste sweet enough to you, you can always add a little sprinkling of a granulated sweetener or a little bit of maple syrup, something that's not interfering, that's for sure. And there's a category of dessert that would fit the same criteria, and it is fruit-based, and that would be what I call, it's an agar gelled dessert. So for anyone here who isn't familiar with agar is a gelling agent. It takes the place in vegan and plant-based cuisine of bovine gelatin. It's not something fake. It's not fake. Agar has been used for thousands and thousands of years in Asian cuisine. It works very much like gelatin, but it's actually easier to use. You can, if you make a gel, for example, and it's too firm for what your application, for what you want, you simply melt it back down and add some more liquid. If it's too soft for what you want, you cool it, add a little bit more agar, and do a test again. And there you go. So you can puree some fresh fruit and make a lovely fruit soup. I call it a fruit soup and salad. It's a very lightly gelled fruit soup, and then pile it up with other fruit and herbs. You can infuse it if you like. And it's quite simple. It's 100% variable. And it's really very satisfying when you think, what are you eating? You're eating something that's fruit, no sweetener necessarily. And you could add a little bit of your favorite cream. You could add one of our cashew creams, like a little bit of vanilla cream or a coconut cream if you like. Somebody remind me later. I just got a sample of a new cream in a box that I'm going to look at and read the ingredients with you. So fruit soup and salad, no fat, no salt, no sugar, no gluten. A lot of fruit desserts are naturally gluten-free, not all of them. You can bake an apple simply, or you can stuff it with anything you like, anything from dates or granola, some nuts, poach a pear. These are all lovely ways to have fruit in your diet. I think that a variety of fruit is a very important thing to help our health. So I eat a lot of vegetables. I eat a lot of green. I also eat fruit. But I do eat what's in season, with the exception of the occasional banana, which is not a seasonal. It's certainly not local. And I like apples very much, so I eat them in the summertime. I love them when they're in season in the fall and the winter time. I have mangoes. I like mangoes very much. I do want to say that I wash all of my fruit before cutting into it. And that includes melons before I cut a watermelon or a cantaloupe or a honeydew or a mango or an avocado. I wash and dry the surface because we want to be careful about pathogens. So that's something I really recommend. So there's lots of fresh fruits. And then don't forget about our dried fruits. I've got some dates here. If you've been with me in other live events, you know that I'm crazy for dates, particularly the ones from Rancho Medalucho. And these are plump Majol dates. We make date paste to use as a sweetener, or sometimes I just take one of these dates, pit it, and I'll stuff it with some nuts, a piece of chocolate, a little bit of chocolate ganache, because I always have that around, or dip it in chocolate ganache. The other day, I don't know, I took a date. I like to put them in the freezer too. When they're frozen, they don't freeze solid, but it's almost like chewing caramel, a caramel candy. I took it out. I had a little bit of a banana. I put a little bit of jam, a little bit of banana inside of this date and a peanut or two. And I had a PB&J without the bread. It worked. It was kind of really interesting. We have an assignment in Essential Vegan Desserts that's called chocolate dipping. And it's a way for students to understand what foods work better to learn to make a nice ganache, and what not all foods are going to dip as easily or as well. Some are going to get soggy, some are going to be perfect. So it's a way to find these things out. But I'll often take, for example, a dried apricot half and just dip it in some chocolate ganache halfway. And I have a treat that took no time at all and really has some health benefits. Going down or up, I don't know. We get to the cooked fruit desserts, and there is this whole category of what I call old-fashioned desserts. Well, they're really beloved, and these were desserts I think of them as our early American desserts, and they were really created to use up fruit, to use up bits of stale cake and extra bread. But all over the world, these desserts exist. A couple of years ago, I was thinking about one of my favorite desserts, fruit desserts from memory, and a lot of the heart I had over this dessert was that I loved baking with my grandparents, and it was called a fluten cake. So this cake was, and that's all I knew, it was called a fluten cake. It was some dough, like a cookie dough, on the bottom of my grandma's big white enamel pan. And then she would chop up apples, and my grandpa was always sitting next to her, chopping walnuts, getting them out of the shell, and then they saved up all the little bits of jelly that were left and mixed it all together, and then it was topped with another layer of cookie dough. So this particular day, I was thinking about it. I was missing my grandparents, and I thought, I wonder if I can veganize this fluten cake, but I didn't know where to start. Well, what do? I went online, I researched fluten cake, and it turns out that, again, because a lot of these desserts are regional, there were many differences, but I found it, and it's kind of a Russian coffee cake. So that was very interesting. Here we have slumps and grunts, and elsewhere there's something called a sanker, which is very similar. These are baked on top of the stove. So you make quite a liquid fruit filling that gets cooked and mix up a loose biscuit dough. The recipe in our course is based on one that I created some time ago and I think you can probably find the recipe on my website as well. It's amazing. For a dessert, a fruit dessert that will serve about 8 people, there's only 1.5 tablespoons of oil in these biscuits. So it's a wonderful thing. You might not want to heat up your oven in the summertime. And this just cooks on top of the stove. It actually, the biscuits steam, which is why the fruit filling has to be so liquid. So in the summertime, I do blueberries or blueberries and peaches, raspberries. In the winter, my favorite combination is pear and cranberry. And then it's sitting on the stove, it's simmering, or maybe I did it ahead. That's always possible. And then rewarm it. Make the biscuit dough in one bowl, which is always a plus. And there is some whole wheat pastry flour in there. Dollop it on top of the hot filling. And the whole trick is that the cover to the pot has to be really tight. So if you don't have a super tight fitting lid, you can put a piece of aluminum foil. It's not going to touch your food. So what is the difference between a slump and a grunt? There isn't any. It's the story goes, or the story that I heard was, are the biscuits slumping into the batter or are they grunting as they steam? That's all I know. One of our favorite desserts in the course, and Patrick has a photo of it. I'm going to show you the very beginning of it while you look at the photo. It's a cobbler. And this cobbler, I have in this pan some butter, and it is actually Miyoko's brand butter. And it gets melted. You mix up a batter again in one bowl. You pour it over the melted batter. Do not stir, and then just put whatever fruit you want on top of it. It's quick, it's nutritious, and it's absolutely delicious. I want to go back to the grunt again because I just thought about something. When your grunt is fresh, you don't want to eat things that are hot. And that goes for sweet food and savory food. So you let it cool a little bit, and then you serve it in a bowl with some of the filling and a piece of biscuit. If you have any left over, what happens is the filling integrates itself into the cake, the biscuit part, which kind of starts to look like cake. And then you have a whole different dessert, and it's really cool. It's really cool. For people who like to make pie dough, or any of my students who need to practice their pie dough, then you can make a, what is it called? A pan dowdy. So that's a dessert with fruit that is going to be baked underneath a piece of pastry dough, and it gets dowdied, and it gets dowdied. There's no doubt that these desserts, as I said, were created to use up extra food. If you have ever made a Betty, you know that that's layers of fruit and breadcrumbs or bread cubes. I like to do it with, I don't often have extra bread cubes or crumbs around. Actually, I take that back, because during this stay at home, I started baking sourdough bread. So I did have some, but I'll take cake that's left over and toast it up. Toasting cake is terrific. It's a terrific way to refresh it. And I'll make this Betty. And so in a way, it's like a bread pudding, you could say, with fruit in it, except bread puddings have eggs and milk in them, or if they're vegan, the equivalent. And a Betty is just much, much simpler. So I'm going to start taking some questions now, and then I'm going to jump back to some of these desserts that I like. Lynn is asking about coconut. Lots of vegan desserts call for some form of coconut. What can you substitute if you're avoiding it? Because it's high in saturated fat. Well, Lynn, I would go back and say that coconut desserts have coconut, and then you're not going to be substituting anything. But my vegan desserts, by and large, are not filled with coconut. I use only a handful of recipes, maybe one handful, if that, specify coconut butter or coconut oil. And so it just isn't necessarily necessary. Now, sometimes a full-fat coconut milk is used in place of shortening, for example. So, you moderate those things. You don't, if something doesn't appeal to you, then don't make it. We have a drop biscuit in the course that's really simple and absolutely delicious. It goes savory. There's no sugar in the recipe. There's no shortening in the recipe. It's made with full-fat coconut milk, but I've had some students use an enriched plant milk, and they liked it. So that can work for sure. That can work for sure. If this is something that you don't like or you don't want to use, then I just say don't, or only use, do a little bit. Natasha wants to know, is there a difference between normal pure chocolate and vegan chocolate? Isn't pure chocolate vegan as well? Well, Natasha, I'm not 100% sure. I know what you mean by pure chocolate, but I'm going to take a guess. And if I'm wrong, just send another question in, another answer. I think what you're asking me is 100% chocolate. That is unsweetened chocolate without any sugar in it, because chocolate, depending on the percentage, the higher the percentage, the lower the amount of sugar in the chocolate. So a pure chocolate is unsweetened chocolate would be a vegan chocolate, as long as there are no other ingredients. You absolutely have to read labels. People are sticking ingredients that don't belong all over the place. I find it really annoying. And it could also be dangerous for people who have dietary considerations. So vegan chocolate is chocolate that doesn't have any dairy in it, and that uses vegan sugar for the sugar component. And that's what makes chocolate vegan. I just actually, last week, I went to a wonderful chocolate online virtual chocolate tasting. The name of the company is 37 Chocolates, if you're interested in a future one. And the chocolates that we tasted were from one chocolatier named William Chocolate. All the chocolates were vegan. They were different different components of different bars of his chocolate line. They were all vegan, and they were all sweetened with whole cane sugar, which is, if you don't know, it's sugar cane with all of the molasses intact. And I thought that was really interesting. I was able to taste it in one of the chocolates, in the Porcelina, which is a very, very rare chocolate, but not in all of them. Marjo wants to know, any ideas on fruit desserts for breakfast or brunch besides muffins? Breakfast fruit tarts? Why not? Why not? You can make a tart crust with really healthful ingredients like nuts and seeds and a little bit of fat or some binding, and bake them off. And then you can fill your tarts with either a fresh fruit or a cooked fruit. I think that would be really lovely. I'm thinking about, blueberries inside of this, or make a raw crust with dates and nuts and, process it until it holds together. And you would have, that is a great idea. I'm going to do that. Thank you. Lorena wants to know the secret to the perfect Canton. Just did the agar test and got excited. The taste is always bland. Well, I will tell you, the secret to a perfect Canton isn't really a secret. It is, the Canton, the agar isn't what's making the result taste bland. You have to make your liquid taste really good before you add the agar and cook the agar into it. So maybe you need to really add some extra. When you're making cold desserts, you really need to flavor them more than you might, because the cold, talking about ice cream or granita or something like that, is going to moderate the taste, the flavor of the flavors. It's going to mute it a little bit. So you want to make sure that your liquid is super flavorful before you make your Canton, and then it will be just fine. And the real secret to Canton, the Fran's rule secret, is to test. So let's say you're making, we're talking about an agar-based dessert here, so a gelled dessert. And you've made it, you've cooked it, the agar has come, the mixture has come to a boil because agar has to hydrate first or bloom in the same way you would use gelatin, but it has to be cooked to a boil in order to activate it. Then you take a little bit, put it in a very small cup, put it in your refrigerator, and then you can judge the final texture and adjust as you need to. We've got a blueberry question here. You love a good lemon blueberry bar, along with a fruity cheesecakes, but you've been vegetarian. So what do I suggest to satisfy this? I suggest that you find some recipes, not just random recipes, but we make wonderful vegan cheesecakes. There's no problem with that. I have a baked one in my book, Vegan Chocolate, and we have a raw one in our course, and cheesecake is no problem at all. So I wouldn't worry about that. Just find some recipes that you like, that makes sense. Read the recipe all the way through and go for it. And if you aren't sure, this goes for any recipe. If you aren't sure, if you're making something for the first time, except for the recipes in this course, all work. They have been zillion tested, and the recipes in my book, I stand behind, and on my blog. But if you're doing some random recipe that you don't know about, cut it in half or cut it by a quarter and try it. Now, Myrna wants amazing desserts without loads of sugar and white flour. You're allergic to gluten and sugar is not recommended. Well, there are some nice gluten-free desserts for sure available. The gluten-free flour mix that I recommend, that I feel works the best, it's the most reliable, is Bob's Red Mill 1-to-1 all-purpose gluten flour mix. It's got a blue label on it. So that works. Gluten-free desserts, when you translate them over with a flour like that, oftentimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So there are other things that you have to learn to do. In terms of tons of sugar, all of my desserts are lower in sugar than a traditional dessert because along the way, I learned that it was possible to cut some of the sugar. But cakes, batter-based desserts, some cakes, they need the sugar for certain reasons. There are for chemical reactions to happen, but we have a lot of choice in sweeteners. So we've got granulated sweeteners, you've got organic sugar cane, then you've got the whole cane with all of the molasses in it. We've got coconut sugar, and those are the primary granulated sweeteners that I use. And on the liquid side, maple syrup, date syrup. Rarely do I use agave, but I'll use it a little bit to make a honey with rice syrup. So find some recipes that are lower sugar or rely on fruit desserts. And I'll tell you, I know I mentioned using dried fruits. Dried fruits have been concentrated. So often when you make a dried fruit, a dessert that's based on dried fruit, no additional sweetener is necessary at all. I do a mango mousse that has no sugar added at all because dried mango is so sweet. If I was making a mousse with a fresh mango, I might have to add a little bit of sweetener. I might not. I find that a little bit of acid, like a lime or a lemon or an orange, depending on the combination, will perk up so you don't need as much sugar. But I want to stop and tell you a story here. It's maybe a little bit embarrassing. I don't know. but it's about reducing sweeteners. We're talking about desserts. So you find the category of dessert that works for you. You know, if you have really cut sugar out of your life, then look for fruit desserts or cantons or something like that. But when I had my very first job as a pastry chef, it was at a restaurant called Luma in Hell's Kitchen in New York. And I was, you know, I had just transitioned from working in a traditional pastry shop with tons of white sugar and eggs and so on. And I had that I'm cutting the sugar out of everything brain. So I cut the sugar back probably by 7/8 in the restaurant's brownie recipe. And my boss came over to me, crossed his arms, and he said, Costigan, we're making brownies, not brown bread. Put the sugar back in. So, you know, I saw his point. I used just enough sweetener to make the dessert taste like dessert and not more. A lot of old-fashioned recipes, if you go to some of the old tried and true books or my grandma's recipes, there was a lot more sugar. I think sugar was probably a preservative, and people's tastes have changed. So we don't necessarily need to add as much. Gabriella wants to know how to get decadent cakes with only a few simple ingredients. Well, Gabriella, the secret to a decadent cake is to finding a good recipe and following it carefully. So a cake is generally flour and leavening and sweetener. Leavening, baking powder, baking soda, vinegar is my go-to egg replacer, really. Remember, I've been doing this for over 25 years. And when I came over to the vegan side and started thinking about vegan desserts, there was no boxed egg replacer. There was no aquafaba. Nobody heard about flax seed and chia gel. So I said, oh, during the war, people used baking powder, baking soda, and vinegar to leaven their cakes. These were accidentally vegan cakes, and I improved on them. So you have, again, flour. I like to use a combination of all-purpose flour and whole wheat pastry flour, not whole wheat flour. That's for bread. That's for pizza dough. Whole wheat pastry flour, leavening, sweetener, usually some fat. I use oil. When you're using oil instead of butter, you use less. You only use 3/4 of the amount because there is no butter fat there's no fat. There are no solids in oil, so you can use 3/4 of the amount. And then a flavoring like vanilla or almond or something. If you're making a chocolate cake, you're going to add some cocoa powder. So actually, cakes don't have to have a lot of ingredients. And the decadent comes from finding a really good recipe, following the directions, and there you go. So Karen's in the Forks Over Knives program, and your question is, can I use date paste instead of dates in making date bread? And how much to use? Well, Karen, I am not familiar with that recipe. It sounds to me like you're talking about a particular recipe, and unless I see it, I can't answer you specifically. You can write to me at fran@ruby.com, and I'll take a look, or that's probably a good question to ask in the Q&A in the Forks Over Knives course. We do use date paste in the Essential Vegan Desserts course where it's appropriate. But if you're using the paste, you know, that's going to be, it's not a liquid, it's not a solid, but the pieces of dates are probably really nice in the date bread. And you might have to, I don't think you'd have to work with the liquid, reducing the liquid too much if your date paste is really thick. I keep mine really, really thick. You would probably reduce the amount of sugar. But if you're using if you're doing something like this is a lot of changing, you're going to have to do a test. So I would ask that question in the course. But dates are incredibly sweet. So You're not going to add the sugar. Karen, tell me what kind of sugar is in that recipe. I'd be curious. Now, Lori's asking about recipes that are I try a lot of recipes that are European. They refer to ingredients you've never heard of or don't have in America. Well, Lori, why don't you hit me up with a couple of the ingredients that you're talking about specifically, and I'll be able to answer that question. I haven't really come across any ingredients that I haven't been able to get, except maybe Oatly creamer. This is probably a good place to look at the creamer. So this just came today. It was just a sample that was sent to me, and it's from Flora, and it says professional plant cream, 31% fat. So that's the same as full-fat coconut milk, I can tell you that. Dairy-free multiple purpose cream, used like heavy whipping cream, plant-based lactose-free. We would expect it to be lactose-free and vegan if it's plant-based, no artificial, whatever. Won't split and no need to reduce. So that's kind of interesting. And I'll tell you, this is really hard to read. But what I see is, where are the ingredients? They're hiding the ingredients. I don't like when that happens, but I have an idea what's in here. Yep. Oh, that's really interesting. It says faba protein. So this is aquafaba based. This is chickpea powder based to some extent. Canola oil, palm kernel oil. So right away, sugar, modified cornstarch, esters of fatty acids, sunflower lecithin, a whole bunch of other things. So I'll try it for sure, because that can be interesting, but I'm pretty good with our creams. I know there's a cream in England that I think Oatly does make a cream that people like, and Silk is making a heavy cream replacement here in the United States, and I haven't had good feedback on it. If anybody knows about any of this, let me know. We're all in this together. And lately, it's hard to keep up with all the new vegan ingredients that are coming out. I try to keep it pretty natural, though. In other words, I think whole foods are the way to go. Now, a dessert is not necessarily a whole food, unless you've made a baked apple and maybe put some nuts in it, a little maple syrup and so on. Or a banana is a whole food. But I try to use ingredients that have a very short ingredient list, like oats and water or almonds and water and cashews and so on, like that. Amy says she can't eat Bob's because of the potato ingredient, the potato flour, but she uses Namaste Perfect Flour for baking, and the cakes turn out rubbery. Well, I haven't used that flour, so I don't know what to say. It might be the flour, and it might be your recipe too. It might be your recipe too. There are, we have a gluten-free flour mixture, one that you can make yourself in the course. And offhand, I don't know every single thing that's in it, but there are variations. If you can't have potato flour, you can switch to another starch. A lot of the gluten-free flour mixes or gluten-free cake mixes are really starch-based, so they're not necessarily so good for you. I mean, if you're baking with cornstarch, arrowroot, white rice flour, and so on, all that white stuff is not very good for our health. But there are ways to add some protein, some better choices in, like nut flour if you're not allergic to nuts, or sorghum flour, which has some health benefits to it. So, it's a little tricky. Now, Mary wants to know about aquafaba meringue. We love aquafaba meringue. Anybody here hasn't made a meringue with aquafaba? My instruction is that you reduce the aquafaba. If there's anybody who doesn't know what it is, I'm talking about chickpea water. And you reduce it by about a third, unless it's homemade. I actually have some chickpeas cooking in my kitchen now, and I will have a whole bunch of aquafaba, and I will reduce that further because the homemade seems to take further reducing, and then whip it just like you would egg white meringue with a little bit of cream of tartar. And it's kind of really cool because you can't overbeat it the way you can with egg meringue. You don't have to worry about tasting it. But Mary's specific question is, can it be browned in the oven rather than being torched? We do baked Alaska in this course, and we ask the students to use a culinary torch. I did have somebody recently brown theirs in the oven, so go for it. Make sure that your meringue is super stiff and watch it really carefully. Okay, so Lorena, in her vegetarian to vegan transition, discovered oatmeal pancakes where the banana is the binder. Yes, banana. So this is a great topic to talk about. That's a good question. You wouldn't need an egg necessarily in a pancake. We have a whole bunch of egg replacements that bind. Banana, sweet potato, pumpkin, applesauce, for example, are all going to bind and add moisture. Silken tofu, that's pureed, without the need for an egg in a pancake. That's not going to necessarily work in a cake. However, in a cake, you need a leavening agent. So that's really the difference. Peter wants to know, what dessert or breading have you made that has the closest texture to gluten? The closest thing that you found is bee-free breads. Well, Peter, I am not gluten. I don't eat gluten-free, so I don't seek out gluten-free breads for myself, although one of my granddaughters is gluten-free, and she's in California, and she has some breads that she likes. If there's anybody here who wants to let Peter know about some good brands. But there are some really nice ones now. I know that because people are telling me that there's all kinds of gluten-free breads happening and gluten-free bread books. So you want to go for it. Jen, I love this question. Thank you. Do you have any suggestions for combining different textures in dessert so it's not all soft? I don't like a one-note dessert. So if I'm eating something that's soft, unless it's something that I want to be soft, every once in a while I do, add some crunch. You can add some chopped nuts. You can add some seeds. You can add some toasted cookie crumbs. You could add some flakes of coconut. You definitely want to layer up not only flavor, but this idea of levels of not everything soft, not everything crunchy. For example, I happen to like a crunchy cookie. That's a different story. But if I'm, and chocolate pudding, when it's warm, my almost instant chocolate pudding, I want to eat that with no embellishment. Almost everything else gets some chopped nuts or seeds or something to give it a crunch. Little granola is always really nice too. So you can try that. That's really important. Thank you. BK wants to know, is there a formula for substituting water for milk when baking cakes and cookies and so on? There is no formula. Liquids are liquids, and yet they're not. So I find that, for example, if we could sort of work backwards or forwards with this, most cakes, for example, vegan cakes will bake equally well if you're using soy milk, oat milk, or almond milk, and actually in that order. It has to do with the amount of fat and protein in the particular product. Rice milk is the closest to water, and so it's not for everything. This is something that you have to play around with. You're not going to get flavor in your cornbread if you're using water. So I would be curious to know why you want to use water in your baked goods, unless it's a caloric, you're thinking about calories. But no, I think you're going to impact the flavor in a negative way. So, Catherine, I see the word galette with fresh figs and blackberries. Can I come over? I love fresh figs, and I haven't seen any yet. So if there's anyone here who doesn't know what a galette is, it's to me, it's the most perfect pie. It's a free-form pie. You roll out your pastry dough. Instead of putting it in a pie plate, you put your filling, your fruit filling in the middle, keeping to about 2.5 inches edge, and then fold it over. It's just gorgeous. And you can do this with fruits. You can make a dessert. You can also make savory galettes with tomatoes, mushrooms, all kinds of things. So that sounds so good. Question about chocolate. The difference between unroasted and roasted. Well, that's another question that I like. So people talk about the difference between raw chocolate and standard chocolate. And if you've heard me speak before, I say there is no such thing as raw chocolate. And I've talked to some of the chocolatiers who make raw chocolate, and they agree that the difference is the beans are not roasted in what's labeled sometimes as raw chocolate, whereas they're roasted to make other kind of chocolate, the more traditional chocolates. I mostly can, and that's the difference. The beans are not roasted. So there is a flavor difference. The idea of raw chocolate, in raw desserts or people who are really following a raw diet, is that the temperature can't go above, I think it's 113 degrees. And while the beans are fermenting, because that's the first step that happens when the beans are macheted out of the pod, they're laid out on something to ferment, and the white coating kind of dissipates. The temperature goes higher naturally without any roasting process. So chocolates have really different flavors, Catherine, not only from unroasted to roasted, but most of the chocolatiers are roasting in a proprietary way. So you would expect, for example, or I certainly did in the beginning, all 72% chocolates to taste the same, but they don't, because how was the chocolate roasted? For how long was it roasted? Pacari is a brand of unroasted chocolate that I think is really nice for an unroasted chocolate. So thank you for that, and enjoy your fresh fig and blackberry galette. That sounds amazing. So Karen is back to the nut bread, calls for 1/4 cup of regular sugar, but you were going to substitute cane sugar. Cane sugar is regular sugar. If you're in the Forks Over Knives course, I know for sure that you're not using white sugar from the soup, white sugar, 99.9% pure. So you're using cane sugar. You can substitute coconut sugar. That flavor profile would work nicely, and give that a try. Amy H says, is this Amy Hamlin? It has happened with other flour mixes also, but can you mix too much, not enough with gluten-free? You really, I hate to say never. Never is really a bad thing to say. There is no gluten to form in a gluten-free batter. So that would not be the cause of your rubbery cake. No, you can overmix in a batter that is some kind of wheat flour or spelt. Spelt is wheat too, but you're not going to overmix gluten when there isn't any. So back to the drawing board on that, Amy. Amy likes SCHR baguettes that are gluten-free. The brand is not all vegan, but many things are. Amy, let us know, please, how to get those, because I know you're upstate New York, but not everybody is. Hi, Lisa. I'm glad you're here too. On the topic, Catherine says, on the topic of fruit salads, a recent favorite you haven't been able to get enough of. Oh, this sounds so good. Listen to this. White peach diced plus lime zest and juice and sea salt. That sounds delicious. I mean, that's kind of like, what's not to like? The fruit has to be delicious. If your fruit isn't really delicious, and it took me a good couple of weeks here till I had a peach that really tasted good, and that's just the way it is. Then go to roasting. We teach roasting fruit in this course, and it's such a different kind of a thing. When you have fruit that isn't as flavorful as you like, or if you want strawberries and they are hard and don't have a lot of flavor, or you need to have strawberries in the wintertime. I mean, I'm not slapping anybody's hands here when I say I like to eat seasonally. Then you roast the fruit, and we do it in a balsamic vinegar reduction with a little bit of lucuma powder, just a little bit. And what that does is it makes the balsamic taste like those really expensive 100-year-old balsamics. Add a little bit of sweetener and pour that over the fruit. And it's phenomenal. The fruit it just perks it right up. It's really delicious. You can also macerate fruit with a little bit of sugar or a little bit of maple syrup. Leave it alone. And what the maceration process is that some of the liquid is going, some of the juice is going to come out of the fruit. But adding the acid, like Catherine said, is really, really, really delicious. Catherine has another question about agave. Well, I mean, I use Wholesome Brands sweetener for their agave, and I find it's fine. But again, I just use a little bit. My friend Char says she's a big fan of fresh figs. Well, sure. You have an Italian background. Did your grandparents grow them? I love fresh figs. So thanks for asking, Char. When somebody brings me a basket of fresh figs, I usually just eat them out of hand. I have to tell you the truth, but I like them lightly roasted or lightly grilled or sliced into a fruit salad and with some with some herbs. I'd like to know what your favorite way to use some figs are. I mean, the season is so short, unless you live in other parts of the country, but oh my gosh, they're so good. Jessie says she'd like to poach pears and was looking at Ruby and found the jasmine poached pears. Well, you don't have jasmine. You don't have to have jasmine. You can use a flavored tea. You can use something else. These kinds of recipes are meant as templates so that you can use other spices and other flavorings. So thanks for bringing that up. Suggestions for kid-tasted approved fruit desserts. Well, my grandchildren they actually like the agar gels, which is kind of like a Jell-O, but a healthier one. And they love chocolate pudding, which isn't a fruit dessert, but I'll tell you what I do to make it a fruit dessert. And that's probably because when I was creating the recipe of the cookbook, we were trying to figure out, I happen to have them in my apartment, and we're trying to figure out how to know when it's 1 minute, which is how long you boil the pudding. And I said, sing happy birthday twice. So they love this pudding for the fun of it and for the taste and how easy it is. This is my trick, and Char knows this with desserts. And many of you who follow me know this. Make something delicious, and then people are satisfied. You'll be satisfied, and your guests and your family will be satisfied when you eat it. It won't be brown bread. It'll be a brownie. It'll be a truffle. But serve really smaller pieces and fill out the plate with fruit. So when my kids get chocolate pudding, myself included, I have a little bit of pudding and a lot of fruit on top of it. I don't know what your kids like, but kids like applesauce. They like baked apples. They like I mean, I think kids really love fruit when fruit is delicious. Hi, Amy. This is a friend of mine. Amy is the director of the Coalition for Healthy School Food in New York and does wonderful work. So she says they sell this, I'm spelling it, Char, C-H-A-R, gluten-free breads in many different countries. So why don't you all, anybody who's looking for a gluten-free bread that it has the Amy stamp of approval, then I would do a Google search and see where you could find it. And there you go. So I know I'm having fruit salad for dinner because I have all this nice fruit here. I have these fabulous plums, and a few of them are getting a little bit on the soft side. So I think I'm going to finish this cobbler and make myself a cobbler to share with a neighbor. And that's how I do desserts. I want to thank you all for coming. It was just a pleasure to be here with you. If anyone is interested in joining the next Essential Vegan Desserts course, it starts on September 10th. You can go to ruby.com and take a look at the syllabus to see exactly what it is you'll be getting. And thank you, and be well, be healthy, eat well, and have a lovely rest of the day or evening wherever you are. Again, thank you for being here.